Okay, today we are starting out with changes on the western frontier. The Native American culture is in crisis. The culture of the Plains Indians at this time, very little was known about them by the Easterners because they didn't see the West as being something that they really needed to concentrate on. Instead, they saw the western plains, as they saw it, were a vast desert inhabited by savage tribes, not really worth their time. However, in the Great Plains region, which is the grassland extending throughout the west central part of the U.S., there were two distinct ways of life. You had the settlement people who settled down and were becoming farmers, and they would travel with the seasons as well, but for the most part they had settled down. These included tribes like the Iowa tribe. On the other hand, you had nomadic tribes who were hunters and gatherers. They would include tribes like the Sioux tribe or the Cherokee or the Cheyenne, who were constantly following the herds. And speaking of herds, the importance of horse and buffalo were very important to the Native American tribes on the Great Plains. Horses were brought in by the Spanish when they first began exploring the New World. The natives acquired these horses through trade. In some cases, they developed wild herds and were able to capture horses from there. But the horses did enable the Native Americans to travel farther. It helped to increase the mobility of tribes. They could increase their hunting grounds and traverse a much larger field of mobility. The buffalo were the main food source for the Native American tribes on the Great Plains. They provided tools as well as toys, clothing, and housing for the Native American families. The family life of Native Americans, most of them lived in small extended family groups, with the men doing the hunting, women were gatherers, they were in charge of the home life. In the settled villages, they were the ones doing the farming as well. The Native Americans valued individualism, even though no individual was allowed to dominate the tribe. They did have things like councils of elders that they would go to for advice. The spirit world was very important to the Native Americans. They felt that the spirits controlled the events in the natural world. And to help interpret what the spirits wanted, they had shamans, who were the medicine men or the spiritual guides of the native tribes. Children were also an important part of family life. Their behavior and their culture was learned through their stories that were told by the elders, through games, and by the examples that were given by the elders of the tribe. Probably the most common knowledge about Native Americans at this time is that for them, land was not seen as something as individual property. Instead, it was for the common use of the whole tribe. Land was considered only theirs temporarily, that they would instead be more important to pass it down to future generations. And that idea is going to conflict quite a bit when they begin to encounter white settlers. The settlers begin to push westward because of lack of land or this need to explore past the Appalachian Mountains. And it's because those whites are coming in that there's this big difference in belief about private property. Vast majority of settlers that were coming through weren't really coming to settle the Great Plains. Instead, they were going further. The attraction for them was the silver and gold that could be found in California and Colorado. And so the Great Plains was just this place to get across. It wasn't considered to be something more valuable or more important than that. However, eventually things happen, and people ended up having to settle down in the Great Plains because of injury, illness, perhaps their equipment broke down. But eventually farming is discovered on the Great Plains. That farming, it was very good farmland. So the U.S. government's going to pass the Homestead Act, and the Homestead Act would offer 160 acres of land to anyone who would live on that land and cultivate it or farm it for 5 years. And for a lot of people, that attracted a lot of people there because land was scarce. It certainly wasn't cheap. And so the Homestead Act offered people an escape from maybe their humdrum lives in the city or from their jobs in the old world where they could get free land in the Americas. And so between 1862 and 1900, somewhere between 400 and 600,000 settlers are going to be coming to the Great Plains. Among them included a group called the Exodusters. And the Exodusters were freed African Americans after the Civil War. After the Civil War, a lot of slaves who gained their freedom didn't really want to stay in the South. A lot of bad memories attached there, some baggage, and just this whole negativity. Racism is very prevalent in the South, so they thought they could go west, and where people are more equal, more likely to be considered equal, and make a difference and make a life for themselves. The people coming across the Great Plains is going to be further increased by the introduction of the railroad. The Central Pacific and the Union Pacific railroads had a competition basically to see who could create more railroads to the west. The Central Pacific began in Sacramento. The Union Pacific began in Omaha. And both companies are going to hire many immigrants to work on these rail lines to create as many railroads as possible. Before the railroad, basically the way to get west was through wagon trains or on horseback. But after the railroad comes through, it takes only 10 days to go coast to coast, which is a major improvement, considering it would take months to do that same traveling through wagon trains and horseback. However, not everyone could afford this, and so there's still people taking wagon trains and horseback, even though there is the train available. So it wasn't for everybody, but it did make some people's lives a little bit easier. Plus, it made just the transportation of goods easier. As people are coming west, the settlers want protection. They are afraid of these savage tribes that they think live in the Great Plains. And so the government is going to come up against the Native Americans. Like I said, the Great Plains were seen as this vast wasteland, that it was a desert. In fact, they'd sort of set it aside as a huge reservation. And a reservation is land that is set aside for the Indians. But the settlers began closing in on those boundaries, and as they close in on those boundaries of this reservation, they begin having conflicts. That's when we're going to see clashes take place between the Native American tribes and the white settlers. Among the most powerful and numerous of the surviving tribes in the Great Plains at this time included the Sioux. And the Sioux, there's lots of different kinds of Sioux, including the Santee Sioux, which were in western Minnesota. And they actually are pretty open to change. They want to try to get along with the whites. You also had the Teton Sioux, which were in Montana. They were led by Red Cloud. They were known for their extraordinary horsemanship, that they were very good horse warriors. You had the Hunkpapas, which gave us leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. The Lakota Sioux. There's a lot of different types of Sioux tribes that you'll hear about. Other tribes included the Cheyenne, which were in Wyoming and Colorado, the Arapahoes in Colorado, the Comanches, who came out of Texas, and the Navajo and Pueblo, which were in New Mexico. So that's kind of an idea of what tribes were available. Like I said, eventually we will have a lot of conflicts between the whites and the Native Americans, and one of the major conflicts is going to be the massacre at Sand Creek. In 1864, this massacre is going to take place against the Cheyenne. The Cheyenne had been known for raiding villages, homesteads, forts for food and supplies. However, some peaceful Cheyenne decided to move back to the reservation for the winter, where they could regroup and recover from illnesses and those kinds of things. And as they're traveling back to this reservation, they're flying the American flag, they're flying a white flag, which means peace. So they were not looking to be attacked. They thought they were doing everything right. Well, the U.S. military is going to be sent out to look for the raiders, the ones that were taking the food. And they come upon this village as they're sleeping next to the Sand Creek, which is why it's called the Massacre at Sand Creek. It's at night, and they come upon it at night, and they attack. And roughly 200 are killed. Most of them are women and children. But what really makes this event stand out is the fact that they mutilated the bodies of the dead, that they disfigured them so much. And that was considered kind of out of line, both by the military, which did not endorse that, and by the Native Americans, because that's just not something you were supposed to do. Another major incident that will take place is called the Bozeman Trail. Now, the Bozeman Trail was a trail that went through the hunting grounds in Montana of the Sioux. And if you remember, we talked about it was the Teton Sioux that were in Montana. But it's a major transportation route to get supplies to the forts. And the Sioux aren't happy because it cuts into their hunting grounds. People are shooting their buffalo, killing their food, and it just isn't working out well. Red Cloud, who is the leader of the Sioux, is going to refuse to go to a reservation, and instead he promises to make the trail run red with blood. That he is going to make sure that nobody's going to use this trail. He's going to make it so dangerous. And he keeps his promise. The army is forced to retreat. Forts are burned to the ground, and the trail is actually closed for a few years. So he does, fulfill his promise. Probably the most famous of all of the clashes is going to be Custer's last stand. General George Armstrong Custer was a Civil War hero. He was called Long Hair because of his long golden locks that he wore in order to stand out. He was very vain, very headstrong. There's some accounts that he possibly had some mental illnesses. So he's an interesting character to begin with. But the reason that he is going to be involved in Custer's last stand is he is sent to the Black Hills. His job is to discover if the gold that was found in the Black Hills is legit. So he's sent to confirm the find. And so Custer sets out with the 7th Cavalry, and there's a lot more men in the 7th Cavalry than will be involved in Custer's last stand. But Custer, with his 250 men, so it's just part of the 7th Cavalry, they go out to scope this out. And so he leaves the rest of the 7th Cavalry behind. He had an Indian scout who told him that there was a camp of Indians, of Sioux and Cheyenne, on the Little Bighorn, which is the name of the river, the Little Bighorn. And so the estimates were that there was probably 1,000. That's what the scout told him, but when he actually came upon the camp, it was probably 2,000 to 3,000, maybe more. It depends on the accounts. The accounts of the 7th Cavalry versus the accounts of the Native Americans at the time are vastly different. Anyway, so he finds this camp on the Little Bighorn, and it's a group of Sioux and Cheyenne. They were led by Chief Sitting Bull and Chief Crazy Horse. And Crazy Horse actually had never had his picture taken, so you just see a artist depiction of him. But Custer decides, we can take him on. We're superior. So he attacks the camp after he splits his troops into 3 different sections. So he's kind of making it tough for him to win this. But they had underestimated the numbers, plus he had worked his troops so hard to get there. They marched pretty much all day, so they were already exhausted. And Custer and his troops are killed to the last horse. According to some accounts, it was in 20 minutes. In others, there's a scout who's allowed to live. In others, only a horse lives. So again, the accounts differ. Anyway, so it is a major impact on the U.S. after this battle because it's a major embarrassment for the U.S. government. The Indians are uncivilized. They had no technology, yet somehow they had managed to wipe out Custer and his troop. Some are going to criticize Custer for his bad judgment, but overall the U.S. really wants revenge because of this. And as a result, the Sioux and the Cheyenne are going to be hunted down or forced up into Canada where they're no longer our problem. And so this whole incident, all these clashes, all these skirmishes are escalating us to a point where we're going to have to do something about the Native American problem as we see it. So there is an assignment. If you look at the end of the video, it'll tell you what to do.